Now, since June 12th, commerce ministers and their delegations have been gathered in Geneva for the 12th Ministerial Conference of the World Trade Organization, the WTO. Now, this ministerial conference, MC12, is happening in a complex global scenario. The COVID pandemic is happening, and because of which the meeting was already postponed a couple of times. There's accelerating climate change, of course, the Ukraine war, and looming economic and food crises that actually have their roots in policies and events over the past 10 to 15 years, but are definitely exacerbated by the COVID pandemic and the Ukraine war. Now, WTO negotiations have been characterized by recurring flashpoints since they started and since the WTO was born in 1995. On one hand, we have developing countries that are fighting for policy space and autonomy to be able to regulate trade and investment to meet domestic priorities, especially food, public health, jobs, incomes, revenues, essential goods and services, and so on. So basically trying to really use trade and trade policy as a developmental input. Now, developed countries, on the other hand, are looking for and have been fighting for regulation that protects the opportunities and advantages for their corporations to access and dominate in markets. And here again, the markets that are most in contention are the markets of developing countries. Also, the WTO has been facing a crisis of legitimacy for almost 2 decades. This crisis of legitimacy already characterized its birth, but then subsequently, there have been long-standing commitments of special and differential treatment to developing countries for developing countries that have not been met. And their priority issues have been used to win concession by the wealthy countries rather than actually meeting, holding true to the promise that trade under the WTO would be used as a developmental input. Decision-making processes in the WTO, that is consensus, have been widely discredited also by charges of bullying, threats to withdraw bilateral aid, conditioning, basic promises of special differential treatment, of safeguards, and so on, with new trade privileges and so on by the wealthy countries. The WTO has also failed to facilitate timely and appropriate responses to food and health crises, most stark during the COVID pandemic, on the issues of intellectual property rights, on testing, treatment, and vaccines. Now, in the ministerial conference that's happening now, there are many areas, the issues of negotiation, but the 2 main areas of negotiation are in the agreement on agriculture and the agreement on trade-related intellectual property rights. And here again, we hear of sharp divergences between developed and developing countries. For developing countries, and for all members, there are the very thorny issues of public stockholding and subsidies for food grains for small-scale food producers, workers, and poor consumers. And these are very important for developing countries, food importing countries, and poorer countries, especially during crises like COVID, and other economic and public health emergencies. Then there's the issue of special safeguard measures that developing countries should be able to take in measures of, in times of import surges and price volatility to protect local incomes. Developing countries are also demanding the relaxing of intellectual property rules on diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines, which is basically testing, treatment, and vaccination, to ensure adequate and timely healthcare during not only the COVID pandemic, but also future public health emergencies. And to this effect, India and South Africa had tabled a proposal more than a year ago. And current negotiations show that the wealthy countries are not supporting that and would like the relaxing of intellectual property rights only to be limited to the issue of vaccines, which is, which greatly limits the ability of developing countries and poorer countries to be able to access the level of healthcare that is needed, even just to handle COVID, which is continuing. So as a result of these types of, how shall we say, crisis of legitimacy issues, and also a recalcitrance on the part of developing countries to give in their public health priorities and public priorities, and on the other side of the developed countries to give up the space for their corporations, there has not been a, there has not been a positive outcome from the WTO for a long time. And the last ministerial conference, which was held in Buenos Aires, which was the 11th ministerial conference, actually had no outcome. And in Geneva now, wealthy countries and the WTO Director General and the Secretariat members, they want to avoid a repeat of what happened in Buenos Aires. So there's a very strong push for compromise on almost all the areas of negotiations. So all contentious issues like public stock holding, special safeguard measures, domestic subsidies, and so on are there are attempts to push these to the next ministerial conference with an intensive sort of work schedule in between. There are attempts instead to come up with some kind of a declaration on trade and food security, but that does not actually address or include the abilities or the rights of developing countries to use particular measures to protect their economies. And then, of course, there is the continuing issue of the intellectual property rights in relationship to the vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. So, of course, from our side, we have particular demands of how we would like to see, what we would like developing countries to be able to do in this ministerial conference.